Director of Safe Havens Interfaith Partnership Against Domestic Violence and Elder Abuse. I'm also a United Methodist pastor, and I have pastored a church north of Boston for 6 years in the past. I have also worked for 2 domestic violence service provider agencies in the past as well. And so I have all these different hats, the hat of leading a faith community and the hat of working as an advocate and the hat also of being a survivor of domestic violence. So I bring all that together to this webinar and to the work that we do at Safe Havens. And I'm delighted that you're here with us today. Allison, will you please advance the slide? So this project is supported by the Office on Violence Against Women at the Department of Justice. And we'd like to thank them for their support because it's the funding that allows us to do this kind of national work and the webinar series and so forth. You'll hear more about the series later, but I'm just delighted to see all of you here. And as I look down the list of people who are with us, I can see many old friends, and I'm just so delighted. Thank you for coming. We're so happy to have you here today. So next slide. Just a really quick thumbnail sketch of Safe Havens, the agency for which I work. We are Boston-based. We are interfaith. Our staff and board are proudly interfaith, and we have been interfaith since the very beginning, which would have been 1991 when we were founded. The reason for that is that we realized early on that all people in all faith communities were facing forms of abuse, and that all faith communities, one of the things we have in common is that we need to figure out, first of all, learn about abuse of all forms, and then also figure out how to respond. So given that this affected all of us, we thought it made sense to make this an interfaith effort from the very beginning. We are also national and local. We started by working with local congregations in the Boston area, very hands-on, et cetera. And also very, very collaborative with our service providers, with law enforcement, with hospital-based people. I mean, with just anybody who had anything. We also worked with people who work with abusers and also child witness violence programs. So we really brought in as much expertise from the community as we could when we were training faith communities back in the day. So it was always very collaborative. And I guess the last thing I wanted to say is just that what we're doing today is a direct outgrowth of that work, and that what we have always done from the very beginning is work to build partnerships between faith communities and the service providers, sexual assault, domestic violence, elder abuse, et cetera, service providers in the community who are the experts on these issues. And we truly believe that we both have a really, really important role to play. So this work is an extension of what we've always done, which is just build these partnerships and make sure that service survivors of abuse have a network of folks around them who know how to help. So with that, I just want to welcome you here. I see a lot of people with a lot of expertise on the call, and I'm really, really glad you're here. So thank you for coming. And finally, I'm not here by myself, of course. I'd like to ask my colleague, Allison, to introduce herself, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. I see lots of friendly names. I can't see any faces right now, but I'm sure that you're also friendly in your face as well as your name. Thank you for thank you for sharing your afternoon with us. We hope that this is important, that you take away some important information. I would really appreciate, though, if you came with a service provider or with a faith community member and you didn't register until late yesterday or today, would you please either chat me privately or in the group? We are going to do a breakout at the end, and we're trying to group faith leaders and their area service providers. I've been able to group some of you already, but if there's anyone else, please do let me know. I also want to just point out that we realized that there wasn't a lot of time for folks to, we advertised this a little bit later than we had hoped because of some approval issues. And so by the time you all got the information, you may not have had time to reach out to faith leaders. And I'll address that at the end when we do the breakout. So thank you very much.
So today we're going to be standing at this intersection of aging, abuse, and faith, and trying to figure out how to better support older survivors of abuse. So we're all bringing expertise to the table. We are all bringing what we know, what we've experienced, the work we've done. So thank you very much, all of you, for being here. And with that, we'll launch into what it means to stand at this intersection.
So first, we're going to take a look at aging in America. As a nation, we are getting older. I know I am, unfortunately. Not unfortunately. That's something that we need to change. But older adults in our community, people 65 and older, or sometimes people 60 and older, in 2016, they numbered 49.2 million people. By 2060, there will be about 95 million older adults, close to 2 times the number in 2016. By 2016, the percentage of the US population of people aged 65 and older will go from 16% to 23%. That is almost 25% of the United States population that will be 65 and older. That's really hard to wrap your head around. So as soon as 2030, 1 in 5 adults will be 65 and older. So if you are not working with and serving older adults now, I'm hoping that you will be coming up in the not so distant future. So we have on this slide pictures of what we at Safe Havens call happy, healthy aging. That's the image that we all want to achieve. And all the products out there and all the media, this is how they portray aging. But when we look at older adults and the long-term effects of racism and ageism and class inequality, sexism, and other forms of discrimination, a more ominous picture appears. 6.6 of all men over the age of 65 are living in poverty. That's bad enough, but when we break it down, we've got African-American men living at 15.7% living in poverty, and Hispanic men at 14.4% living in poverty. That's a significant slice of older Americans who are struggling to make ends meet. The picture for women is even more troubling. 10.7% of older women overall are impoverished, but more than 21% of both Black women and Hispanic women are living below the poverty line. This is the result of a lifetime of lower wages, of taking time off to raise children, of lesser education, and since women live longer, of making retirement savings stretch over more years. Aging is really complex. People consider older adults to be from 60 to 105. That's 45 years. Think of from birth to 45. Well, so 60 to 105, that's a lot happens during that time. An adult could be 60 and already suffering from chronic disease and struggling physically, or they could be physically sound and demonstrating or living out that idea that 60 is the new 40 or 40 is the new 60 or however that goes. But they might be physically sound and still experiencing creeping dementia, or they could be 87 and out every day riding their bike. At the same time, older adults are racially, ethnically, and in every other way diverse and becoming more diverse day by day. The sea change in society's attitudes towards the GLBTQ community means that gay and lesbian couples are trying to figure out how to negotiate nursing homes and other institutions that have not in the past served out members of that community. Transgender adults are encountering assisted living situations. And for those of you who haven't seen Gen Silent, it's available and we highly recommend it. There may be health complications, ongoing transitions, increasing vulnerability, dementia, capacity issues, and physical disabilities. And in addition, by the time we reach 70, many of us, and particularly those of us who are women, have suffered layer upon layer of trauma. Now, this past year has certainly we've seen a lot during this past year, and it has showed us our ageism in high relief. From suggestions that older adults should sacrifice themselves for the cause, to minimizing the pandemic because it only affects older people. This has been an exercise in understanding our own negative understandings of aging. It's true that we've all been in this together, but some of us have been in a cruise ship and others of us are paddling alongside in a kayak, or a leaky kayak at that. In addition to the ageism that the pandemic has highlighted, racism and classism have meant that COVID-19 has been particularly dangerous and deadly in communities of color due to long-term healthcare, economic, and environmental inequalities and injustices. Many people in our communities are particularly vulnerable to the savagery of this disease. So we need to fight not only abuse, not only a pandemic, but also the racism, ageism, and classism that are ravaging our communities. Layers of trauma. Many of you probably understand this language, layers of trauma. But in case you don't, what we mean by it is that many people who are older have experienced historical trauma or oppression of some kind, and often of several kinds over the years. Older adults have been living at the intersection of gender, race, immigration status, sexual orientation, and gender identity for many years. In working with older adults, it's important to remember these layers and intersections of trauma. And I'll turn it over to Anne Marie.
Yes, we've included a sort of a quick summary here of abuse of older adults, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. But I want to preface that, especially looking at who's part of this group, by saying that at Safe Havens, we are a faith-based nonprofit, and we do not consider ourselves in any way elder abuse experts or adult protective services or advocates, and that's many of you, but not us. So we really wanted to honor the older adults who have taught us so much. And also we're deeply grateful for folks like Bonnie Brandel, Candy Heisler, Mary Toomey, Art Mason, Lisa Furr, Risa Breckman, Tova Kasdan, all the many experts. And Alice is on the line, on the webinar as well, who have really taught us so much. So we're coming at this from a faith community point of view. We do know the basics, and I wanted to just throw out some basics here so that we are all on the same page. But just so that you know, we are in no way planning to call ourselves experts. So the first point I want to make, next slide, please, Allison. I think it's really important that we fully appreciate how much older survivors need all of us. And by all of us, I mean advocates and faith leaders and adult protective services and area agencies on aging, law enforcement, prosecutors, bankers and lawyers, friends and neighbors. Each of us has a unique and really important role to play. Because each of us is part of that older adult's life in some different way. So, and also each of us have our own expertise. So it's just really important that you're all here today, that we're here today to talk about how can we work together? How can these puzzle pieces sort of fit together so that we can work together to end elder abuse, but also provide the kind of complex support that older adults need because they're living complex lives and they're having complex experiences. It's not just one thing or the other, it's many things. And so just to know that we all have our parts to play. So next slide, please. Elder abuse isn't new, but talking about elder abuse, and especially in faith communities, really is new, I think. So in 2014, the Elder Justice Roadmap Project authors, who include Risa Breckman, M.T. Conley, Bonnie Brandel, interviewed 750 stakeholders and kind of asked them, if we were trying to understand and prevent and identify and respond to elder abuse and neglect and exploitation, what would we need? And so this is sort of a roadmap, and I highly recommend it to you. You can just get it online, but I really recommend the sort of comprehensive summary of things that they felt we need, including prevention, intervention services, community education, long-term work to end ageism and violence. Those are the kinds of sort of foundational things we're going to need to stop abuse of older adults. So the roadmap kind of gives us a way to move forward, and it also reveals elder abuse as a really pressing and critical social crisis. I would call it a spiritual crisis as well. Not only because America is, not only because the US is aging, but also because older adults are not always getting the help they need. So they're not necessarily reaching out for help at this point. So next slide, please. So I wanted to talk first about what abuse of older adults is not, because I think there's a lot of confusion around this. I'm not talking about unintentional injuries, for example. There's lots of ways that any of us can be harmed. These are all important, obviously, these injuries, but they're not necessarily abuse. Older adults could be injured by falls or other just accidents. Caregivers may be doing their very best, but just not know how to take care of an older adult, or physically they can't support the older adult. You know, a developmentally disabled child might be trying to take care of older parents. I mean, there can be all kinds of scenarios. There could be someone who themselves weighs about 105 pounds who's trying to um, maybe turn in bed a partner who is much heavier than that and just can't quite get that to happen. So there can be people who are trying their very best um, and have no intention to harm someone else, but they still need help, obviously. um, so another example of how older adults could be harmed is that some people have medical conditions such as Alzheimer's or some forms of dementia or brain trauma or some other illness that causes them to be aggressive or challenging or sort of out of control. These are not, they are rare cases. I want to make sure we all know that those are rare cases. And sometimes that scenario is used as by someone who's abusive as an excuse. So it's important to sort of sort that out too. But do know there are people who can't control their behavior due to some medical condition or something. So it's just important to name that not everything is abuse. Next slide. So this is the definition of elder abuse from the roadmap. Includes physical, sexual, psychological abuse, as well as neglect, abandonment, financial exploitation of an older person by another person or entity that occurs in any setting. So it could be the home, the community, the facility, either in a relationship where there's an expectation of trust, or when an older adult is targeted based on their age or disability. I would add where it says physical, sexual, psychological, of course, coming from the faith community, I would add spiritual as well. And we've heard quite a lot from older adults about spiritual abuse and how important that is to them. So that's something to always keep in mind as well. But this is the definition from the roadmap. So let's look at this a little bit now. We first of all have power and control and neglect and exploitation, willfully done, in other words. And oftentimes the abuser's getting something out of it, either free labor or access to resources or work done for them or whatever it is. It's also a pattern of behavior over time. So it's not a one-shot thing. This is why someone scamming me on my cell phone is not necessarily abuse, because I don't have any relationship with them. It needs to be a pattern of behavior over time, something that happens several times. There's also multiple and diverse tactics. So there's lots of ways that older adults can be controlled, or that someone could establish power over them. So one of the things that I think is important to know about any form of abuse is that in the hands of an abuser, anything can be a weapon. So when I say multiple and diverse tactics, just remember that anything, including the car, house, insurance, money, credit card, family, faith community, the faith leader, the desk scissors, your sexual orientation, your immigration status, your bare hands, anything and everything in the hands of an abuser can be a weapon. So it's just really important to constantly remind yourself of that. Anything can be a weapon, including the best parts of who the victim is. If the victim is loyal and hardworking and trying to do the right thing and all of that, that too can be a weapon used against them. So just really important to remember all that. The abuser may exploit the victim, demanding that they clean the house or give up their money or other resources or cater to the needs of the abuser. They may willfully neglect the victim by withholding food or water, medications, medical care, basic care. All of these things have happened. And over time, the abuse or neglect and exploitation, are continued through a pattern. And it's important to know that that victimization is a process. None of us are just born victims. It's a process. We are groomed into this in a way. And so it uses all kinds of tactics like sexual, physical, verbal, spiritual, financial, psychological abuse, isolation, intimidation, threats, stalking, and so on. So all of that is probably going on. As we age, victims become more vulnerable typically. So that's one of the particularities to elder abuse that makes it at times markedly different from other forms of abuse. There are more avenues to exploit me if I am more vulnerable, physically vulnerable, or even cognitively vulnerable. So abusers sometimes prey on older adults. They can confine or isolate an older adult by taking away their dentures or their walker, hide things and make the older adult feel that they are losing their memory, threaten to send the older adult to a nursing home. Because older adults often rely more heavily on a wider cast of characters to assist them in their everyday lives, there's a wider network of people whose trust and assistance is needed, and any of these people have the potential to be an abuser. So there's also this widening cast of characters as abusers at the same time that we are with age becoming more vulnerable to abuse as well. Now, so when does it become elder abuse? This is a good question. The age at which abuse becomes elder abuse differs by state. So it's usually 60 or 62 or 65. But domestic and sexual violence advocates have noted that their services are often not, they're underutilized by people who are, say, 50 and above. And we know, or we suspect, the abuse does not magically stop when you turn 50 or 45 or whatever it is. It's just that these are folks who are often not reaching out for services at all. So there are these folks who are slipping through the cracks. And for that reason, sometimes service providers, domestic or sexual violence service providers, are thinking of that whole coterie, 45 and up or 50 and up, who are not receiving the justice and the support that they require or deserve. As many of you who work with victims of domestic violence and sexual assault understand all too well, these forms of abuse affect, and elder abuse as well, affect men and women and non-binary folks of all races, faiths, education, income levels, professions, sexual orientations, physical and cognitive abilities, countries of origin, immigrant status, etc. So on some level, this is all of us. This is really all of us. Okay, next slide. So tragically, older victims of abuse are not getting help often. One study in New York found that only 1 in 23 cases were reported or sort of came to light in some official way. Um, and often, older adults are targeted. Um, Targeted because they will be less likely to tell, and or targeted because they will be less likely to be believed. So it's really important to put these two things together, that people are not reaching out for help, but also they're being targeted because of their age. So next slide, please. It's hard to tell also how many older adults are abused because the research is very difficult. There's one study, Mark Lax, who found 1 in 10 community residing cognitively intact older adults were abused in the past year. But the study itself, this was a 2009 study, first of all, the participants had to be able to answer the phone because it was a phone research study. They had the physical mobility to get to their phone and to answer it, and the cognitive capacity to follow and answer the questions, and the economic capacity to have the phone in the apartment in the first place. So none of the respondents lived in facilities such as assisted living or nursing homes. None of them didn't speak English or couldn't understand the questions. None of them were prevented from answering the phone by an abuser, etc. So it's likely that this number is low. And in addition, there's some research showing that older adults with dementia are even more likely to be abused in some way. So it's a significant problem. Let's say that at least. Next slide. So another question is, who are these perpetrators? You heard me say that it's an increasing cast of characters as we are older. I think if you're used to a domestic violence or sexual assault lens, you're thinking intimate partners, but this could be adult children, grandchildren, other family members, caregivers, other residents and staff as well in institutions, lawyers, bankers, neighbors, friends, anyone in a position of authority, anyone in an ongoing relationship where there's an expectation of trust. And that is a lot of people. The most common abusers, I think the stereotype in everyone's mind is the folks in a nursing home or something like that, but actually the most common abusers are family members. But as you see here, there's a pretty good cast of characters. There could also be multiple abusers. So an adult child and that child's partner, for example, or multiple adult children. It could be all kinds of different scenarios. So just important to remember it's a pretty big cast of characters. And I wanted to talk for a minute about the consequences too. Physically, of course, we're talking about wounds, fractures, contusions, all kinds of injuries. Neglect leads to pressure sores, other kinds of injuries. Exploitation undermines freedom, reduces resources, saps the strength and life of older adults. Psychological consequences can include depression, fear, guilt, shame. I don't think any of this is news to anyone. Economically, there's a tremendous loss of possessions, financial assets, homes, resources, just people being sort of sucked dry by abusers. Spiritually, survivors of abuse in later life report feeling disconnected, broken, hopeless, confused, violated. They feel like they have lost their dignity and their humanity, and sometimes they report even losing their faith, feeling as though they are just so totally disconnected from anything meaningful. And this aspect of abuse, you heard me say earlier, is really important to older adults. We've heard from older adults who talk about sacred objects being destroyed or thrown away by the next generation. And that could be anything from a drum or a token of some kind to military medals to anything, books of scripture, things like that, where folks are separated from the things that are meaningful to them and that make their lives meaningful. Um, so the result of all this is sort of these unnecessary hospital visits, unwanted nursing home placements. Um, there can be entire families and multiple generations of members who are affected by the abuse of the older adult. Even without completely understanding what's happening, everyone can be affected. So the other thing to keep in mind, and especially for those of us who are faith-based, is that this is ultimately also a life and death ethical issue, because older adults who are victims of abuse are 3 times more likely to die prematurely than their non-abused peers. So this is life and death. This is not how to optimize your health in old age. So just really important to keep that in mind as well, that this is a life and death issue. So next question is, where does abuse occur? I'm kind of taking you through these questions because I know when I was coming up to speed on elder abuse, I was sort of like, why, when, where, who? So where does it occur? Again, sort of this widening lens, because with domestic violence, you might think of a home, although it can happen anywhere, obviously. Here we're thinking homes, hospitals, nursing homes, and long-term care facilities, basically wherever older adults are living or being, are places where abuse occurs. So the stereotype that this is nursing homes is not true. And again, please remember that most of the time it's members of your own family who are abusing you. So there are some red flags to keep in mind, and that we're hoping faith leaders particularly will keep in mind. There's the repeated accidental injuries, the bruises, the pressure injuries, the burns. When someone is just unable to follow through on a treatment plan or on medical care, not when they're making an informed decision, but when they just seem unable to follow through even though they would like to. Sometimes survivors say they're walking on eggshells, or they may characterize someone in their life as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which speaks to that public persona, private reality disconnect among people who abuse. So when you hear things like this, if possible, it's great to take some time to speak with the older adult privately, to just check in and kind of find out what could be going on. There are other red flags as well. If someone's living in an unsafe or unsanitary place, or has poor hygiene, opens a whole bunch of new lines of credit, changes financial institutions frequently, or is isolated, unable to meet with you alone when they used to meet with you, says or hints at being afraid or harmed, or these kind of what I call veiled disclosures. My son has a temper, or I have to ask my husband for permission, or things like that that someone may say. These are good times to carefully and in private, if you can, um, ask just ask the next question. Can you tell me more about that? As a way to check in and find out what's going on. And there are also some red flags that suggest that someone might be an abuser. Maybe they're actually verbally abusive to the survivor while also being charming and friendly to others. Maybe they attempt to convince you that the older person is incompetent or crazy. They disparage the older adult, say terrible things about them, or maybe they're overly attentive when you're around, which kind of masks the controlling behavior. They're like hovering over someone. Maybe they're threatening suicide or homicide, or they're stalking someone, or restricting an older adult from making decisions, or making it difficult for them to attend appointments, or maybe religious services, or being part of groups in their faith community. Any of those are things that a faith leader might recognize, or that an advocate might see. Um, Now, here's the thing though, any of those red flags could be an indicator of abuse, but maybe not. There might be other circumstances. And if these red flags are not present, that doesn't mean that there's no abuse either. So these are just kind of things to keep in mind as you are thinking your way into the world of elder abuse and faith. And with that, I'll turn it over to Allison.
Thanks, Anne Marie. It would not be a Zoom meeting if someone didn't remember to unmute themselves. I want to take a second to see if anyone has any questions. We didn't address this earlier. If you do have questions that are pertinent to what we've covered so far, please type them into the chat. If not, you can hold them for the end if you want, either way. But right now we're going to, now that we've gone over some basic information about elder abuse and what it is, let's look a little bit more closely at the intersection of with faith. Now, when you think about faith and you think about older adults, we have the silent generation, which are the oldest people of the oldest generation. They are the most affiliated. 89% of the silent people in the silent generation affiliate with some kind of faith community. That's a lot of people that are faith affiliated, but even down to the younger millennials, 64% are still consider themselves faith affiliated. That's really something when you think about it. And a lot of, a kind of a place for you to connect to if you're a service provider. Whoops, sorry about that. Now, in the midst of this high level of organized religious affiliation, it's really important to remember complexities about this. An individual's relationship with organized religion could be kind of painful or risky or iffy even. It could be stressful and simply impossible for lots of reasons. Think about how faith communities have so often excluded GLBTQ members, on trans people who are trans, and silence victims and survivors of abuse of any kind because they don't want to talk about it in their faith community. So for a lot of reasons, people may become estranged from their faith traditions. However, just because you are not connected to an organized faith community does not mean that you aren't deeply faithful or deeply spiritual and have lots of life-affirming spiritual practices. So we really need to remember how the many different ways that faith can be an invaluable resource for anyone, but in this case, we're talking about older adults. Not only are older adults very faith affiliated, they are also deeply engaged in the lives of their congregations. The American Psychological Association says religious affiliation is the most common form of organizational participation among older adults, with 50% reporting that they attend services weekly. That's really, let that sink in. That is something. 50% of older adults who are obviously not so much during COVID, but hopefully that's opening up and you can find older adults attending weekly services. One important thing to remember is that for many older adults, and particularly for older adults who are faith affiliated, abuse has a significant spiritual impact that can be just as important as the physical and financial and other kinds of impacts. And this was a quote, "What has been most violated are intangibles: love, faith, trust, and hope. The result is spiritual suffering and a serious sense of loss and powerlessness." And we, Safe Havens, had spoken with this older survivor of abuse, and this was her quote. This was already 11 years ago, but it remains very powerful. So why is faith important to older victims of abuse? We have spoken at length about the importance of faith in our webinar, our first webinar of our series back in, I think, at the end of January, and you can find it on our website. But just to quickly summarize, in the midst of isolation that is often caused by abuse and compounded by aging and all the other things that go along with that. Religion, faith, or spirituality can help victims and survivors stay connected or reconnect. Religion, spirituality, or faith connects victims and survivors of elder abuse to the community and their community and traditions, to language, to memories, family and culture, history of and community of origin or country of origin, a creator, God, great spirit, higher power. Second, in the midst of the craziness that is abuse, where victims often feel off balance and out of control of their lives, faith can help people stay oriented and centered in their lives with their values and beliefs, whether they are praying several times a day facing Mecca, or worshiping in a sanctuary that faces east, or marking time in terms of holidays or the high holy days, or experience time as a series of varying liturgical seasons or periods. Faith can help victims stay oriented in space and time and centered on their values and human dignity. Third, elder abuse takes away so many things: their home, their family, their neighborhood, trust, safety, freedom. Faith is one resource that victims and survivors can keep with them in the midst of those losses, and faith can help grieve those losses. Survivors and victims themselves tell us that they need and want the support and guidance of their faith communities. Given that the abuse they have suffered affects them spiritually as well as physically and emotionally, this makes sense. And faith and spirituality are often connected to healing. In a Canadian study, Elizabeth Podniak found that many older women actually named a specific faith community where they would seek help if they experienced abuse. So if you are a service provider and you want to meet older victims where they're at, faith communities would be a good place to start. Respondents, especially minorities, often indicated that their first stop would be a member of the clergy if they were to discuss their domestic violence with anyone. Many women felt that they would be likely to seek the help they need in their places of worship. This was a study done in 2008. This just speaks to the importance of faith communities, and is even more the case when we're talking about older women of color and older individuals in minority populations. More than many other formal care providers, faith leaders are in a position to identify, assess, and intervene in abusive situations because they see older people in their own context over time and have ongoing access to their residences. We always talk about how faith leaders have the perfect location to see victims, not just older victims, but even domestic violence victims. They see people in their everyday lives, unlike service providers who only see them for short periods of time, and often on Zoom now, or before in the office or the shelter. So faith leaders are real great allies and can potentially be great allies in the work against elder abuse. Faith leaders who are faith community leaders and members of faith communities are perfectly located to be a listening ear, to see or hear what may be abuse, and be a bridge to community resources and services. They represent an invaluable opportunity to reach faith-affiliated older adults with information about elder abuse and available services, and with life-saving support and safety. Our goal going forward is to make sure that faith communities and faith leaders are as big a resource and as little a roadblock as possible for older victims of faith who are affiliated. Now, of course, not all survivors identify with a particular faith community or a particular faith tradition, but all survivors need to be heard and affirmed. They all need someone to bear witness to their stories, someone to accompany them on their journey towards safety, justice, and healing. That someone could be their faith leader or someone in their faith community. When faith leaders and faith communities receive training and resources about elder abuse, faith can be a more effective resource for older victims of abuse who are faith affiliated. The faith leader may have known the older adult for years and may have been through other crises together and thus be a trusted confidant. The faith leader may know the family across generations. A referral from a faith leader is more likely to be trusted and acted upon than a referral from someone that they don't know as well. And faith leaders can help their congregants access the services that they would otherwise not necessarily know anything about. Faith leaders are well placed to recognize abuse and understand the dynamics within their community. We faith communities can provide compassionate listening, acknowledgement of the abuse, and spiritual and material support. Trained and engaged faith leaders can also intervene earlier, which means the trauma will be lessened and the likelihood that the victim and perpetrator can be successfully helped is increased. Without training, resources, and partnerships with advocates, can be silencing and denial, blaming and judging, minimizing, unsafe solutions and quick fixes, manipulation by abuser, couples or marriage counseling, and dead ends. Now, we don't want to be Pollyanna-ish here. The picture's not always so rosy. Faith leaders can help with all of these, help connect victims and survivors to services. But without training and resources, that's not going to happen. And in most cases, the faith community has not been trained. They don't know how to listen to the experiences of victims. And most of them haven't borne witness to the suffering that might be happening right under their noses. Faith leaders have sometimes denied that abuse is occurring. They have silenced victims, and often not on purpose, with the very best intentions, sometimes endangered and prolong the agony of older victims of abuse. And that's why it's so important that we're all here today. By learning more about the abuse in later life and ageism, and by building partnerships with one another, we're laying a foundation to better support older adults. All right, Anne Marie, I'm going to turn it over to you. I think you have something to add here.
Well, yes, I wanted to tell you a story about my own time as the pastor of a small congregation, a Christian Protestant congregation north of Boston. I had some lens of domestic violence when I started working at this congregation, or started leading this congregation, but I really had never heard of elder abuse. This is back in the day, granted, but still, I had never heard of elder abuse. And so one of my congregants who lived independently in her own apartment, she was older, she was sort of like everybody's favorite grandmother. Everyone loved her. And even though she couldn't get into the sanctuary for services, so she was not typically there at the service, but people went to visit her. She was part of every group. She was, everyone knew her and loved her. And one day she called me and she had fallen and been taken to the hospital with a broken arm. So I go to the hospital, I visited with her. It was a very typical, you visit, you pray, you talk to the person, check in with how they're feeling, etc. We had all of that visit. And I took it at face value that she had fallen and broken her arm. It was not until months later, and then not from this person whom I'm going to call Mary, not from Mary did I get this news, but from Mary's family, I heard that she had not just fallen and broken her arm, but rather her grandson had broken into our apartment and demanded money. And she turned him down. This had happened before. She had decided she was not going down this road. She turned him down and he pushed her. And that's how she fell and broke her arm. So I found that out, again, not from Mary, but from her family months later. And even then, Mary didn't want to talk about it or have any kind of conversation about the grandson or what had actually happened or any of that. She was a very private and proud woman who did not want to talk about it or talk about her family in anything but positive terms. If I had known, I mean, looking back on it, I think that was classic. I don't know how it could be more classic elder abuse than that. I should have I should have talked to her about this. I should have connected her to services. I should have called Adult Protect. There were a lot of different things that Mary and I could have figured out together to maybe make this situation a little better. But I offered none of them. I had no idea. I didn't have referrals. I didn't have resources. I didn't know what I was talking about or seeing. I could not even name it. So I tell this story to let you know that I wasn't a bad person. I didn't have bad intentions. I just didn't know. And when I learned more about elder abuse, a huge light bulb went off over my head. And immediately I'm thinking, oh no, that was definitely a place where I should have brought referrals and resources and all that. So as part of this mea culpa, I have pledged to Mary in absentia, I have pledged to Mary that I will continue to do this work, especially with my faith community colleagues, because I just think it's so important. It's right there in front of us. We can see it, we just can't name it. And just to bring it up to the present, I will also tell you that just a couple of years ago, we had a student intern from a local seminary at Safe Havens who said to me the following. He said, and I don't know, he's like 25 years old or something. He says, I have never heard the word elder and the word abuse used in the same sentence before. He went on to medical school. He is no intellectual slouch, but he had just not heard this. So it's just so important that we get the word out to our communities, our congregations, etc. So with that, I will stop because I could go on and on and on. So next slide, please. It's just really important to me that we're working together. So some basic information about elder abuse is always a good thing. I wanted to look a little bit more carefully at faith leaders and advocates and how we can work together to support survivors of elder abuse. So first, here are some ideas for my faith community colleagues and friends. If you are not clergy, please don't think you're off the hook, because when we say faith leaders, we mean both clergy and lay leaders. We think there's an important role for all of us within a congregation. So these are just some ideas for people who are affiliated with faith communities or who are part of that faith community broadly written. So first of all, we have to break the silence. And the story I just told is a perfect example. We have to break the silence. We have to talk about it because that will make it easier for survivors to talk about it. And if we don't break the silence in our congregation, then what we're saying to the survivors is, in addition to bearing the burden of the abuse you're experiencing, we also want you to bear the burden of breaking the silence in our congregation. And I would argue that survivors already have enough burden to bear without us putting that on them. So we have to figure out, clergy, laity, all of us together who are faith affiliated in any way, how can we talk about this? How can we break the silence? Just some ideas. We could include older survivors of abuse in prayers. We could write about elder abuse in newsletter articles. We could talk about it in homilies, Devar Torah, khutbahs, sermons, etc. Every way that we are talking within the congregation. And then we could teach about it in adult education. We could provide this information to everyone, because even folks who are not experiencing elder abuse right this minute may know someone or may come across someone that they need to provide services or support or referrals to. So just really important that we talk about it and break the silence. So next slide. We also think that congregations can be conduits for getting information out into the community. So we can put the local hotline number or elder abuse referral numbers on the congregation's website, on the Facebook page, under an email signature, in a newsletter footer. We can put it in the footer and push save and just have it in every newsletter. so that someone isn't found walking around with that particular newsletter, but rather, it's in every newsletter, every bulletin. We can publicize this information about local services and where are my community resources. I want to know who's in my location and get the information out about them. So educate about hotlines, who should we call, when is it confidential and safe to call, when are they free, when are they open, is it 24/7, do they have language capability, do they have TTY for those who are deaf or hard of hearing. I mean, just all of these, like, get this information out. And also now during COVID, it's important to get information out that these service providers are still providing services. When things shut down, these folks did not shut down. So it's really important to let people know this work is still happening in our communities. So that they're there, that they provide resources, that they're open is important. Okay, next slide. The third thing we can do is prioritize safety. So some survivors may not be able to call the hotline for themselves due to safety concerns or capacity issues or whatever. So our ability to call for help, remember, anybody can call the hotline anonymously or not. So you could call on behalf of a survivor, ask for information if they are unable to call for themselves. Remember that during COVID, if folks are still shut down, they may be shut in with an abuser, which is at best awful and at worst potentially lethal. So it's just really important to remember that access to help that people may used to have had, or access to the ability to make phone calls that they might have used to have, may not still be there now. So just help people get the information they need. And although we don't have to be the experts as people of faith ourselves, we just need to know who those experts are and how to get hold of them. So building those relationships now is important, but also having those referral numbers at your fingertips. So the fourth thing we can do is, I call it being compassion in action. So we're checking in with people, we're listening carefully, we're keeping the red flags in mind, we're remembering, we're seeing things around us through a lens of this could be abuse, or abuse does happen in my congregation or in my community. We're providing referrals and information. We're asking questions privately if we're concerned. We're asking who and how we can get help, what we can do to help. We're staying in touch, etc. And just a quick story about this, because this kind of networking is preventive. This is like, isolation is a form of abuse and a tool of abuse. This kind of networking is the opposite of that. So one story that we learned about in the paper was a case that occurred in Florida, where a woman's grandson and the grandson's partner basically took her out of her own home where she was living independently and locked her in the tool shed in the backyard. And then they were doing things in the home that were illegal. But that's what happened. Well, it rolled around to Sunday morning, and this woman's best friend at her church, with whom they had been, like, they were baptized the same week. This relationship went way, way back, as many faith-based relationships do. And this woman's best friend said there's no way she would not be at services, or she would miss a Bible study without letting me know. There's just no way that would happen. And so she called the police for a well visit. The police went over, they found the grandson and the partner, and they were arrested and charged with crimes. It was a crime what they did. And they found the older woman and got her out of the tool shed. And although she was traumatized, she at least survived this situation because of her friend in her faith community. So we just all need to be looking out for each other, making sure that things are fine, checking in, etc. Huge role for faith communities. We are so networked. We are the opposite of isolation. And finally, just this sort of full circle support. I know that during COVID, I've talked to my colleagues. I know that phone calls, visits, meals, prayers, scripture studies, worship services, all of this is still happening. all of that is vitally important to older adults. All of what we do as congregations and as faith-based people networking are important to older adults. So please continue to provide that kind of support. And then also, there's other older survivors in your community who may need support. So you could mail gift cards for groceries or gas or pharmacies or whatever it is to the office address of your local domestic or sexual violence service provider, and just let them know you're hoping that they will help you get these cards into the hands of people who need them. So just thinking about that full circle support. And then finally, some ideas for advocates. I'm hardly the one because but some ideas. First of all, continuing to learn, as we all do, about ageism and elder abuse. This is a relatively new field. It's possible that many of us would be saying a couple of years ago, I have not heard those two words together in the same sentence. So we just all need to learn. I know the first time I heard the word ageism, I knew that I had never heard that word and I had no idea what they were talking about. And it really took me a while to learn what this is that we're talking about. We can also learn more about the services in our community and build that network, especially after COVID. Maybe we can sit down and have what we call a muffin moment with each other. Like, I need to know who my adult protective services are. I need to know who the ombudsman at the local nursing home is. I need to know these folks. I need to have a relationship with them and be able to trust them. And then also considering how, if you're agency based, how the agency can better meet the needs of older adults. Because are we really doing that? If people who are 45 or 50 are not calling for services, why is that? How have we framed the work that we're doing or the problem that we're solving or the resources we're providing or whatever it is in such a way that older adults just don't see themselves in that picture? And then also building partnerships with local faith leaders. We're hoping they're reaching out for you. We hope you'll also reach out to them. And then also consider applying for an Abuse in Later Life grant through the Office on Violence Against Women at the Department of Justice. These grants really encourage communities to build the multidisciplinary team that it takes to do the complex and multidisciplinary support that older adults need. So just another idea. And finally, I just wanted to point out, and you can find this on our website, or probably Allison has put it into the chat box or something, I'm not sure. But anyway, this is our toolkit that we put together after doing focus groups with survivors, with all kinds of folks who work in the area, and then also with faith leaders. And we put this together. There's resources for faith leaders, like a bookmark that you can just hand out in your community, in your congregation, that has some basic facts and some basic resources. There's a brochure that has a little bit more information for faith leaders, clergy, and lay as you begin to learn a little more. And then there's a booklet that's a little more in-depth, talks about mandated reporting and those sorts of things. For when you really need to dive in a little bit deeper. So those three things are for faith leaders. For advocates, we put together checklists about how to reach out to your faith communities, what to learn ahead of time, what kind of questions to ask, or strategies to take when you're meeting for the first time, how to build those relationships. We also have an outreach guide that talks about some of the outreach barriers or challenges that we as Safe Havens have experienced, and then some strategies for getting around those. And then for both faith leaders and advocates, we have a partnership guide where we had a Elder Abuse and Faith Summit in Chicago a number of years ago, and we asked everyone in the room, what's your best wisdom? How are we going to build these partnerships? And that's what's in the partnership guide. So the other thing you'll see on these resources, you can see them in the orange part here to the left of the title. You'll see the watermark that has words like safety, justice, peace, dignity, respect, well-being, etc. Those were the words that we asked all three groups: faith leaders, advocates in the field of elder abuse, and also survivors. what do you bring to the table? What are the values you bring to the table? And these are the common values among all of us. So I know that sometimes we might disagree about how to respond or something like that. We keep coming back to these values. Our values are that older adults have safety, that they have justice, compassion, peace, respect, etc., well-being. So we can always come back to these values and remember that this is sort of the common ground on which we stand, even though there are differences, obviously, between faith communities, advocates, etc. We have our own communities, but this is our common ground. So that's what's in our toolkit. There are also additional resources. Allison's going to put that slide up that we encourage you to take a look at. The slide deck is available in the chat room as well. We have upcoming webinars for you to consider. Domestic violence through a Jewish lens, supporting the GLBTQ community who are survivors of faith through abuse situations, and also supporting African American survivors of faith. Those are coming up in May and June. Those are webinars for advocates, and then for victims and survivors of faith, and another webinar for advocates as well as faith leaders on working together to support folks is May 11th, Compassion and Accountability. And this is where we're going to talk about how faith leaders respond to folks in the community and in the congregation who are themselves abusers. So how do we do that? And we've got some expertise coming in the form of David Adams from Emerge to talk with us about that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Allison for some discussion and questions, feedback, etc.
Okay, I hope I'm not muted. I am going to stop the share, and I am hoping that we can have a conversation. What we're going to do is Mary Kate from NCJFCJ is going to divide us into groups. It looks like on my list of participants, there are no faith leaders with accompanying advocates. If that is incorrect, please email me or chat me in the chat box. I want to point out a couple of things if anyone takes off before I get to it. I do want to point out that if you are a service provider and you want to still have this conversation with your faith community leaders, and I say leaders, clergy, and lay leaders, we're going to have this posted on our website within the next week or two, and you could set up a time to share the recording and then on Zoom, and then have a conversation with your faith leaders about, and I can email you the questions, and the questions are actually going to be in the chat. But for right now, Mary Kate is going to put you all into groups of 4 or 5 people, and we have some questions that we'd like you to discuss. I will just summarize or tell you what they are right now. We're going to ask you to talk amongst yourselves about what you're seeing in your community in regards to elder abuse, and what are your concerns. We're going to ask you to talk about what agencies in your community are supporting older adults. Do you know what they do? Do you have connections with anyone there? Now, and I think that the third question, if you get to it, it might be a better question for if you have faith leaders in the room, but what is one concrete thing you can do together with your faith community to raise awareness about elder abuse in your own community? What and who would be involved to make that happen from each of your organizations, the faith community and the advocacy agency? What would you want any other agencies involved or organizations? And figure out next steps and develop a timeline. And what do you need to make this happen, and can you commit to that? So those are the questions that we're going to ask you to chat about. And then we're going to ask you to come back we're going to give you about 15 minutes to chat amongst yourselves, and then come back for a short debrief, just so we can hear what you were chatting about. And you do not, we're not going to be in the rooms with you, because we want you to have this conversation amongst yourselves. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
I'm looking at the gallery view, I don't see a lot of people, but I see that there are 20 people still. I'm hoping that for this portion of the program, you will turn your video back on, keeping yourself muted until you're talking, and that would be great. Oh, Anna, thank you for your request for a toolkit. I will send it out, and you just saved me from having to email you that. It will come out soon. We're not in the office right now, but I will be going in shortly. I'm looking. Thank you all. It's always so nice to see everyone's faces. Now I know who we were talking to. Thank you. So I wanted to just take a couple minutes. We wanted to hear, I mean, ideally this in our dream, not dream, in our plan was that each of you, I think you're all advocates of some form or another. And our hope was that there would be a faith leader or two with you in your group, and you would talk about this to address things in your own community. But I hope that you still had a productive conversation, and I'd love to hear from at least a few of you one thing, whether it was a great idea or some new information or a next step, that's something that struck you in the conversation about elder abuse and faith that you had in the past 15, 20 minutes or so. And I'm going to let you, we're a small enough group, I'm going to let you unmute yourself and talk. And we'll see if that's too unruly or not. Hopefully not. Anyone want to start? Nothing interesting? Yes, Beth.
I will. Hi, I'm in Mississippi, small town Mississippi, and my counterpart, Joanna Randolph, she and I met together in our breakout room. And one of the things that I shared with her, I'm all new to domestic violence anyway, but elder abuse especially. I've certainly heard the phrase before. It's not anything new to me, but I guess probably one of the things that I could see happening here, because it is small town Mississippi, and this might not sound really good, but I have the feeling that when we actually get out there and try to get information across or get folks to help, I tend to think I'm going to be met with some resistance. Domestic violence hasn't been a problem as far as speaking about that in the community. And there have been, this organization has been in business since 1995, 96. We've been around for about 26 years, but it's primarily family oriented, women and children. And, you know, we are a Southern town. So it's not, and I don't want to say walking on eggshells, but in a sense, I think that there's going to be we're going to have to be careful how we approach it to let people know that this is a real thing and we need their help in addressing it in our community.
Beth, you're from Mendenhall, right?
Yes, ma'am.
We were in Mendenhall.
Really?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I think we worked with Angel Wings Outreach Center. Yes, and let's set up a time to talk, because we don't have a lot of time here, but I do have some ideas for you. There is no question.
Okay, I wrote down your email because I want that toolkit too. So I'll email you so that we can.
And if anyone else wants to talk to me or to us, but I will say this, that yes, you will be met with resistance. But one thing that we have found, faith communities, and that's our expertise, is working with faith communities. Mm-hmm. I have found that in some ways it's easier to talk about older adults than it is to talk about domestic violence, and certainly easier than sexual violence. Right. Because older adults, like children, it's easier to see them as a victim. Mm-hmm. And so no one wants to see someone who's older being treated as a victim. But we can talk more about that. I want to let other people who might have something to say do that. But I'm glad I recognized Angel Wings Outreach Center, and we'll talk. Anyone else want to tell us something that struck them? I mean, definitely being afraid of being met with resistance is really something that can happen. Anyone? No? Nothing interesting? Yes, Anna, thank you.
I just want to say one thing that we were spending some time talking about right before it ended was the need for housing. So I was curious because we're really seeing that here, a need for housing for older adult survivors. And that's emergency housing, transitional housing, long-term housing. So I was curious in other parts of the country, and they all agreed. So we had me from Illinois, somebody from Florida, somebody from Arizona. Alicia, I just forgot where you were from.
I'm from Mississippi, but way
Mississippi.
south of Beth.
So it seems to be a very common problem throughout. So, you know, it seems to me that, you know, maybe there's some opportunity there. I know the faith community has done a lot of innovative things over the years in regards to helping people with housing. So maybe that's, you know, be interested to see how that's being addressed in other parts of the country and what kind of creative solutions or options are being done, because there's absolutely a need everywhere.
Anne Marie, do you want to address that a little bit? Because I can't remember, I'm blanking on the name of the organization.
Just very briefly, there's a group of folks called Spring Alliance, and they are using nursing home facilities, and sometimes these are faith-based nursing home facilities. I'm thinking of Elder Safe in Maryland, for example, is a faith-based nursing home facility for emergency shelter. And it's not long-term though. It doesn't solve the housing problem at all. But it does begin to think about what that might look like, and to provide that emergency relief that people may need. So the consortium altogether is called Spring Alliance. The other picture, I think, is to build partnerships with domestic violence service providers so that we're providing shelter that's responsive to the needs of older adults more effectively. And I don't know, some of you on the call, Alice, especially you, may be able to respond to that better as well. But you're absolutely right. We're struggling to kind of figure out what this might look like. There are some models that don't work so well for older adults who need particular medical care, or who, you know, have physical needs or whatever it is, that you can see where older adults are kind of falling through the cracks. So if there's anybody else who has ideas or would like to jump in on that, I would love that.
Anyone else want to?
Okay, Allison, you guilted me into putting my video on. I hope you're happy, and I can see both you and Anne Marie are very, very happy. Hi, ladies.
Okay, so this is a national expert here, folks, who can steer us in the right direction.
Yes. Alice, take it away.
Thank you, Alice.
Please. First and
you.
foremost, thank you. First and foremost, I think it's absolutely wonderful that these types of trainings are still going on, because I personally, and that's just me, and it can be because we've been so busy, haven't heard anything in a while. And so when I saw this come out, I was like, oh, yes, I gotta get on board and see what's going on.
Yes.
So, I mean, the good news is, and just to kind of let all of you know, I'm not trying to steal the show here, Anne Marie and Allison, but just so the rest of you kind of have some background, I have been doing this work for over 25 years. And so the good news is it's getting better. And by it's getting better, I mean the awareness and finally the acceptability that abuse does occur in later life. You know, we I think are doing a really good job of outreach and raising awareness. The bad news is we still have so much more to do and so much more to go, especially in working with faith-based communities. I unfortunately will admit that we have not had any luck here in Phoenix. And the domestic violence community did do a couple of different conferences with faith-based leaders just in general, and then that kind of got dropped by the wayside. But again, just to kind of echo what we've been talking about all morning, it's so unfortunate because in the lives of older folks, faith and religion and spirituality is so important. So I just, the only thing I could say is let's just keep treading on because we are making some progress. It is getting better. And my only final thought on this, Anne-Marie and Allison, is, and I know you've said it several times, Allison, it's really unfortunate that we don't have any faith-based leaders here in the group today, which kind of speaks, at least to me, it speaks volumes about that resistance and hesitancy that still exists in faith-based communities, in some faith-based communities, I'm sorry.
I'm going
All
to.
right, so I'm done.
Thank you. I'm going to just say that in all fairness to the faith leaders, we don't have, I mean, we have sent this out to a bunch of faith leaders, but our goal, our idea was that the advocates who we had been training and who had participated in some of our trainings in the past would reach out to their faith leaders. Clearly that didn't work, and or we didn't have enough time. So we will do a better job coming for the next one, which is coming up on May 11th. For those of you who are here, please feel free to send the flyer out to your faith leaders. If you need help with that, let us know. I guess we kind of thought that faith leaders might also initiate, but we'll work on that. And but yeah, there is a lot of hesitancy and Beth, yes, there will be resistance, but I think that faith leaders do want to know about this. This is also difficult because a lot of people we're reaching out to are advocates. The majority of them are advocates. So that said, does anyone else want to share anything that they learned that they were excited about or just scared about or disappointed about or anything? Because we've got just a few minutes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes. Quick thing. Like I signed up as a faith leader, but
Yes,
and I sent it out to, because I am a minister, so I sent it out to a lot of my minister family, cousins, and things like that. But what I will do for the next class, I will personally send out to all the congregations that I'm affiliated with. Because I think, like you said, it is disappointing. I look to see did anybody show up in the chat, in the attendance to see if anybody I said talk to came. And I'm the only one who came. Like I said, I don't have an organization that I'm completely under, but I am an ethic provider, a facilitator in training. So I'm just short of those hours.
I am very thankful that you spoke up, because I did know when I was putting you with there were a couple of, are you near Kennesaw?
No, I mean, I'm not too far from Kennesaw, but
Well, so I was going to, they didn't show up, but I was going to put you in a group with them. That's another thing, is that we had a lot of people sign up, but a lot of people, and there were some faith leaders on that list, but stuff happens. So thank you for pointing that out, Joanna. And definitely, please do reach out to all of send it to all your faith communities that you know. You don't have to call, I mean, it's best if you call them and say, hey, we want you to come, but do what you can. Does anyone else
have? Definitely important. So yes, thank you. I will definitely do that, because like I said, even if it didn't go to my credit hours, I thought it was important. Like, wow, this is awesome. So yes, so I enjoyed speaking with Beth. So thank you for having me. And yes, I wanted to make sure you knew. I know what I put down there, but I thought other people were coming. But thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add anything? Any great ideas about advertising or connecting or anything? I don't want to ask people to talk, but you did stay. Yes, please, Latanya.
Very good. Yep. My name's Latanya. And I will share that in the group that I was in, there was a really good idea that Megan shared with us. I think I got it right. Yes. That Megan shared with us in regards to about exploitation. She talked about the fact that if there's a lot of lack of education. So when, you know, the elder adult goes to some convenience store to buy multiple gift cards. And so if the sales clerk was educated, perhaps they would be able to assist with, or maybe doing an APS report, Adult Protective Services report, or just, you know, talking with that particular elder about that particular purchase. I just thought that was really interesting. I had never thought about that before. But I thought that was interesting. And of course, getting our banking community connected and educated would be great as well.
Well, and that's, the faith community can help with that. I mean, the faith community can talk about financial exploitation and talk about the different scams. I mean, I know that my own parents have been targeted by scams, and so but they never heard about it from their faith community. So that's another role for the faith community, working with faith communities to bring in a third party to talk about these things. And I do want to point out that financial scams, when we talk about elder abuse, and we interchangeably talk about that and abuse in later life, sometimes we are not, there are lots of people who are focusing on the scams, and those are very important because there's no question it's a form of financial abuse. But in general, we're talking about people who have a relationship with the older person. So there's that expectation of trust. Most older adults aren't trusting someone that calls them on the phone. Sometimes they do, but yeah, I know Anne Marie's like, oh, well, maybe, you never know, but there's no expectation of trust. So we're focusing, when we talk about elder abuse, we are focusing on situations where there is an expectation, or there could be an expectation of trust. Thank you for coming, Beth. I'll be in touch. You'll be in touch. But again.
Oh, sorry. I just want to point out real quickly that financial institutions are now seeing enough of a drain from people's bank accounts and resources that they are doing training on these issues. And that can be important not only for older adults, but for younger victims of abuse as well, and that there's often a financial component. So, yeah.
But again, a great place for faith communities to bring up the topic. That's a great opportunity. Anyone else? Thank you so far for all of you who have spoken. Does anyone who hasn't spoken care to share? Bernice, you look like you're talking, but
yeah, I am. In our group, we did bring up about having the different agencies come to a meeting at our church, and I work at Bible Center Church in Pittsburgh, to come to a meeting to talk about elder abuse. And now listening to Mary Ann talk about the financial institutions now doing having meetings with people so that they understand the different scams and things that are going on. And so I think that would be great. And I'm also concerned, and I'm surprised that the faith communities are holding back. Why is that? Why do you think that is?
What do you mean by holding back?
Meaning that they, you were just saying that, you know, I reached out to these different faith communities and didn't hear from them. You know, there were faith leaders on the Zoom call. Why do you think that is? Because it's surprising to me. I mean, I've been with this particular church for 5 years, and I oversee what we call congregational care callers. And so we split the membership up. Each person has maybe 10 members or something like that. And we call at least once a month. During this pandemic, we've called a little more often just to check on people, see how things are going. Do you need anything? How can we pray for you? Like that. And then we log it in so that the pastors can see what's going on in the congregation, because with both of them working full time and all the other responsibilities as pastors, then our responsibility is to uphold their arms. So it is surprising to me, because this is the first time I've ever been involved in something like this. It's very surprising to me that the faith communities are not involved. And I'm just wondering if you have an idea why that is.
So many ideas. So many ideas. One of the things is it might be our Safe Havens way we did outreach, but let's take Safe Havens out of the situation. I think that we have found that faith communities, faith leaders are really overwhelmed right now. And they are, after the year of being of the pandemic and not being able
Answering my question.
person, they are now trying to ramp up to meeting in person again. It's been a tough year for a lot of people, not just faith leaders. So that's one thing. So Marie, you want to jump in with another thought?
Bernice, you're rapidly becoming one of my favorite people because you're asking great questions. I think that faith communities and faith leaders, if they've not had any background in this at all, in sort of control and so forth, that it can be very intimidating and difficult. It's challenging. I mean, and also I think none of us wants to believe just as having it happening in our congregations or in our families, and especially at church, you were sort of characterizing and I think a lot of family-centered churches would like to believe that there isn't abuse happening in families, and so to hear something painful like the fact that you're more likely to be abused by your family members as an older adult than you are by someone in a nursing home, I mean, that's painful for me. And so I almost feel like there's a bit of that, and just not, sort of, I'm speaking from a faith community point of view now, hiding our heads in the sand and this will go away or that it doesn't exist. And I so appreciate you being here, and also I so appreciate folks in faith communities who are willing to say, yeah, this is a problem and here's what we're going to do about it, and just march forward instead of getting ourselves in knots about, does this really happen in our faith community? Because of course it does. And we need to be able to address it. So I think there's that too.
I also think that there is, there's a big need to have advocacy agencies, service provider agencies, and faith communities having a relationship and developing trust. And if there's that trust that's developed, then it's more likely that the faith leaders would be willing to talk about this, and they might be willing, if I called up my clergy person and said, would you join me on this call? It might be easier than them just signing up out of the blue. The other thing is that, it's easy to sign up for a webinar because you can sign up and it's free. And if something comes up, you don't have to do it. Oh, maybe, oh, it's a beautiful day. I wanted to go out and play a round of golf. I mean, who knows? I'm not saying that clergy people or faith community members would be doing that, but I know that's what my partner just did. Just left 2 seconds ago to go play golf because it's beautiful out. So I think those are other things to think about. I am mindful of the time and our time with NCJ, FCJ, who is running the platform for us. I want to invite you all to reach out to me. You should have my email address, but I also have your email addresses, and I'm going to be sending a follow-up email in case you didn't download the slide deck and the evaluation. I'm going to be sending it out over the next day or two. You'll have my email if you have questions, if you want to talk. Anne Marie just put it in the chat again. If you want to receive a toolkit, whatever, we are happy to help you move this forward to working with your faith communities or to working with your service providers or connecting any way we can help and provide you with assistance. That's what we're here to do. And for service providers who are trying to do this work, we don't want you to have to reinvent the wheel. Please take what we offer and use it. If we gave you an idea that resonates for your community, go and use it, and we would be thrilled. So with that, any last comments, questions, Anne Marie?
I have one comment. I just got a text message because I was saying, how could you guys miss this class, to my cousin? And she said, well, she said, if I had come, where would I even start? I said, why don't you check with your sick and shut-in list?
Yeah.
That's where you start, Sick and she said, oh, you're being funny. So I'm just saying, yes, sick and shut-in is the first place I would go to check
I
on
agree.
and paying attention to abuse. If you're going out, not just like she said about, calling more. So now COVID's kind of, what it is, we could be a little bit more mindful, like you said, start paying attention to some of the awareness. So that's why I said sick and shut in. So I'm done.
Right. Well, and that looking at your shut-in list through a lens of abuse, or knowing that abuse can happen in our congregations, or Bernice, what you said about the congregational care callers,
Right.
if they have some background on this, think
Yes.
of how much earlier they could get resources and help into people if they could kind of identify early, oh, this might be abusive. Maybe I should ask some questions privately and safely. But with that kind of training, we can be the front line. I mean,
Sure.
we in faith communities might see this much earlier than the police are called, or there's a terrible injury. We might be able to avoid the police and the injury if we're
Sure.
able to get resources and referrals in there early. So
Yeah.
I love the congregational care callers, and I'm really loving that you're hoping to maybe connect them with some training.
Well, there's a training on May the 1st
Oh,
and the
great.
12th, and about 9 or 10 of them will be on that training.
That's wonderful. That's where we start. Yes.
Yes,
And
yes.
with the shut-in list that you mentioned. Joanna, I think you're so right.
Everyone, it would be very helpful if you would take a few minutes to fill out the evaluation that either you download or I send you. Please be honest. If you have ideas about how we can improve this. This is our first attempt at doing this kind of a webinar. So we welcome your feedback, and I'm going to call it for the day. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you all have a good afternoon or more. Yes, it's afternoon everywhere, I think.
Okay.
Be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
God bless.